The crystal chandeliers of the Worthington mansion blazed like captured stars, casting prismatic light across the marble floors where New York's elite gathered in their finest silks and jewels. Margaret Hayes kept her eyes downcast as she moved through the crowded ballroom, her plain black servant's dress a stark contrast to the opulent gowns swirling around her. She carried a silver tray of champagne flutes, weaving between clusters of laughing debutantes and distinguished gentlemen who never noticed her presence, which was exactly how it should be. Mrs. Worthington had been explicit in her instructions that morning. You will serve refreshments, you will remain invisible, and you will not, under any circumstances, speak unless spoken to, her employer had said, her thin lips pursed with disapproval. Margaret had simply nodded, as she always did. After 3 years working in the Worthington household, she'd learned that compliance was survival. The orchestra began a waltz, and Margaret retreated toward the servants' corridor. She'd just reached the doorway when a commotion rippled through the crowd. Whispers cascaded like a wave. "He's here! The Duke of Blackwood has arrived!" Margaret paused, curiosity momentarily overriding her training. She'd heard the stories about Duke Alexander Blackwood, the British nobleman who'd come to America to expand his railroad empire, whose steel-grey eyes could supposedly freeze a man's soul, whose business rivals often found themselves ruined within months. He entered the ballroom with the confidence of someone who owned not just the room, but the entire city. Tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored black evening coat, Alexander Blackwood moved through the parting crowd like a predator among prey. His dark hair was swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and aristocratic severity, but it was his eyes that captured Margaret's attention, even from across the vast room. They were indeed grey, but not cold. They burned with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Move along, girl," hissed Thomas, the head butler, appearing at her elbow. Margaret startled, nearly dropping her tray. She hurried toward the servants' passage, but not before those piercing grey eyes swept across the room and, for just a fraction of a second, locked with hers. The connection lasted no more than a heartbeat, yet Margaret felt it like a physical touch. Her pulse quickened irrationally. She shook her head, chastising herself for such foolishness, and disappeared through the doorway. In the servants' area below stairs, the kitchen staff worked frantically to keep the endless stream of refreshments flowing. Margaret deposited her empty tray and was immediately handed another, this one laden with delicate pastries arranged like a work of art. "Back upstairs, quickly," Cook ordered, wiping sweat from her broad forehead. "And for heaven's sake, don't let young Master Edward corner you again." Mrs. Worthington was furious about last week. Margaret's jaw tightened at the mention of the Worthingtons' eldest son. Edward had a habit of finding her in dark hallways, his hands wandering where they shouldn't, his breath reeking of whiskey and entitlement. She'd learned to avoid him, but in a house this size during a ball, that wasn't always possible. She nodded at Cook and climbed the back stairs, steeling herself for another hour of invisibility. When she emerged into the ballroom again, the atmosphere had shifted. The Duke commanded attention without appearing to seek it, standing near the orchestra in conversation with Mayor Hewitt and several railroad magnates. Margaret positioned herself near a marble column, offering pastries to passing guests who took them without acknowledgement. She was furniture, scenery, nothing more. "The Duke refuses to dance," a young woman whispered to her companion nearby. Caroline Astor practically threw herself at him, and he merely bowed and walked away. "I've never seen anything like it." Her friend tittered behind her fan. "They say he hasn't danced with anyone since his wife died 5 years ago. Tragic, really. Some say he loved her so deeply he became the cold man we see today." Margaret shouldn't have listened, but the words painted a picture that didn't match the rumors of ruthlessness. A man who loved deeply, who mourned deeply, that was something she understood. Her own mother had died when Margaret was 12, leaving her alone with a father who drank away their small savings before abandoning her entirely. The Worthingtons had taken her in, but their charity came with a price paid in exhaustion and humiliation. "You there with the pastries," a voice cut through her thoughts. Margaret looked up to find Mrs. Worthington bearing down on her, her elaborate purple gown rustling with indignation. "Why are you standing idle? There are guests by the terrace doors who require refreshments. Move!" Margaret dipped a quick curtsy and hurried in the indicated direction, her heart pounding. Any misstep tonight could mean dismissal, and she had nowhere else to go. The terrace doors stood open to the warm September night, allowing cooler air to circulate through the overheated ballroom. Margaret approached a group of elderly matrons who were fanning themselves and gossiping about the various attendees. She offered the tray, and one woman waved her away dismissively. "Too sweet. I can't abide too much sugar." The others ignored her entirely, continuing their conversation as if she were invisible once more. Margaret was turning away when she heard a familiar, unwelcome voice behind her. "Well, well, what do we have here? My favorite little sparrow, all alone." Edward Worthington appeared from the shadows of the terrace, his cravat loosened and his eyes glassy with drink. Margaret's stomach dropped. She tried to step around him, but he blocked her path, reaching for her wrist. "Don't be rude, Margaret. I just want a moment of your time." Please, sir, I have duties," Margaret said quietly, trying to pull away without causing a scene. Edward's grip tightened, and he leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "Your duty is to do as I say. Or have you forgotten who provides your food and shelter?" Fear and anger warred within her chest. She'd endured his advances before, always managing to escape with her dignity barely intact. But tonight he seemed emboldened by alcohol and the chaos of the crowded ball. "The lady asked you to release her." The voice was low, cultured, and carried absolute authority. Edward's head snapped up, and Margaret found herself looking past him to see Duke Alexander Blackwood standing just feet away, his expression carved from ice. The noise of the ball seemed to fade into the background. "This doesn't concern you, Your Grace," Edward said, trying for confidence but achieving only petulance. "This is merely a household matter." The Duke took a single step forward, and somehow that movement contained such threat that Edward immediately released Margaret's wrist. "I believe I shall determine what concerns me," Alexander said, his grey eyes now holding all the coldness the rumours promised. "And at this moment your discourtesy toward this young woman concerns me greatly. You will apologize and remove yourself from my presence." His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Edward's face flushed red with humiliation and anger, but he was drunk, not stupid. One didn't antagonize a duke, especially one known for destroying his enemies. "My apologies," he muttered, not looking at Margaret. He stumbled back into the ballroom, leaving her alone with the most dangerous man in New York. She clutched her tray like a shield, uncertain whether she'd been rescued or simply traded one threat for another. "Are you injured?" The Duke's voice had softened fractionally, though his posture remained rigid. Margaret shook her head, not trusting her voice. She should curtsy, thank him, and disappear before anyone noticed this interaction. Instead, she found herself trapped by those intense grey eyes that seemed to see past her servant's dress to something underneath. "What is your name?" he asked. "Margaret Hayes, Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She finally remembered to curtsy, nearly dropping the pastry tray in the process. "Thank you for your intervention, but I should return to my duties." She needed to leave before Mrs. Worthington saw them together. The consequences would be severe, but Alexander made no move to let her pass, studying her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You carry yourself with more grace than half the titled ladies in that ballroom," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Tell me, Miss Hayes, do you dance?" The question was so unexpected that Margaret actually laughed, a brief, startled sound that she immediately tried to stifle. "Servants don't dance at balls, Your Grace. We serve those who do." The absurdity of the question, of this entire situation, made her momentarily forget the proper deference. Something flickered across Alexander's face. Amusement, perhaps, or approval. "An arbitrary distinction based solely on circumstance of birth," he said. "I find such conventions tedious." He extended his hand toward her, and Margaret's heart stopped. He couldn't possibly mean, "Dance with me, Miss Hayes." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with all the authority of his position, and yet his eyes held something else entirely, a question, an invitation, a challenge. "I can't," Margaret breathed, even as every fiber of her being wanted to reach for that outstretched hand. "It would be improper. I would lose my position." "Your Grace, please." But Alexander stepped closer, and she could smell sandalwood and something indefinable that made her dizzy. "Do you want to dance, Miss Hayes? Not what you should do, not what's proper. What do you want?" No one had ever asked Margaret what she wanted. In her world, want was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival dictated her choices, and survival meant invisibility, obedience, safety. But standing here with the Duke's grey eyes fixed on hers, with the music floating through the open terrace doors, with her wrist still warm where Edward had grabbed it, suddenly, survival didn't seem like enough. Life should be more than just enduring. Margaret set down her tray on a nearby table. Her hand trembled as she placed it in Alexander's, and she felt the warmth of his skin through his white glove. "Yes," she whispered, making a choice that would alter everything. "Yes, I want to dance." His fingers closed around hers, strong and steady, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt something other than fear or exhaustion. She felt alive. Alexander led her from the terrace back into the ballroom, and Margaret was dimly aware of the shocked gasps, the sudden silence of conversations, the orchestra faltering for a moment before continuing. The Duke of Blackwood, who hadn't danced with anyone in 5 years, was walking a servant girl onto the floor, Mrs. Worthington's face had gone purple with rage. The other guests stared with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. The scandal would be enormous. But then Alexander's arm encircled her waist, his hand firm against the small of her back, and Margaret forgot about consequences. They began to move, and despite having never learned proper ballroom dancing, her body followed his lead naturally. He guided her through the waltz with confidence, his eyes never leaving hers. The ballroom spun around them, a blur of judging faces and glittering lights. But in the center of it all was this moment, this impossible, dangerous, perfect moment. "You're trembling," Alexander observed quietly. His voice meant only for her. "Courage, Miss Hayes. They can stare all they wish, but they cannot touch you while you're with me." There was steel in those words, a promise and a threat combined. Margaret found her voice, emboldened by his presence. "You've just created an enormous scandal, Your Grace. They'll never forget this." A ghost of a smile touched Alexander's lips, the first genuine expression she'd seen on that austere face. "Good," he said simply. "I want them to remember. I want everyone in this room to know that I chose you." The words sent heat rushing through Margaret's veins. She didn't understand what was happening, why a duke would risk his reputation for a servant he'd just met, but she couldn't deny the connection humming between them like an electrical current. As the waltz ended, Alexander didn't release her immediately. He stood there, holding her in the center of the ballroom while society watched and whispered. Then deliberately he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of courtship, not pity. The murmurs crescendoed into shocked chatter. "Miss Margaret Hayes," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the room, "I would be honored if you would allow me to call upon you." Before Margaret could form any response to this lunacy, Mrs. Worthington appeared like an avenging fury, her eyes blazing. "Your Grace, I must apologize for this servant's presumption. She will be disciplined immediately." She reached for Margaret's arm, but Alexander moved between them with predatory speed. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet that somehow cut through all other sound. "Miss Hayes is under my protection now. If any harm comes to her, I will hold you personally responsible. Are we understood?" Mrs. Worthington paled, trapped between her outrage and her fear of offending a duke. She managed a stiff nod, her mouth working soundlessly. Alexander turned back to Margaret, and the coldness left his features when he looked at her. "Go pack your belongings," he told her gently. "My carriage will be waiting at the servants' entrance in 1 hour. You don't belong in this house anymore." Margaret should have been terrified. She should have refused, should have clung to the terrible security of her servant's position rather than trust a stranger, no matter how powerful. But when she looked into Alexander's eyes, she didn't see cruelty or manipulation. She saw recognition, as if he understood exactly what it meant to be trapped in a life that was slowly suffocating your soul. "Why?" she asked, needing to understand. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, and something vulnerable flickered across his face before the mask returned. "Because I know what it is to be imprisoned by others' expectations," he said quietly. "And because when I looked across this ballroom tonight, you were the only person here who seemed real." He stepped back, the Duke once more, formal and distant. "1 hour, Miss Hayes. Choose freedom." Then he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing alone in the center of the ballroom while New York society erupted into the scandal of the season. Her life as she knew it was over. Whatever came next would be dangerous, uncertain, possibly devastating. But as she looked at the shocked faces around her, felt the weight of Mrs. Worthington's fury and the other servants' disbelief, Margaret realized Alexander was right. She'd been existing, not living. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her, really seen her, and offered her a choice. Margaret straightened her shoulders, ignored the whispers and stares, and walked with her head high toward the servants' entrance. She had less than an hour to pack her few belongings and decide whether to trust a feared duke who just upended her entire world with a single dance. As she descended the narrow stairs, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration, she knew she'd already made her decision. Freedom, she was about to discover, came with a price, and Alexander Blackwood always collected his debts. The Duke's carriage waited exactly where Alexander had promised, its polished black exterior gleaming under the gas street lamps like a sleek panther. Margaret clutched her small leather satchel. Everything she owned in the world fit into one bag, and hesitated at the servants' entrance of the Worthington mansion. Behind her lay 3 years of grueling servitude. Ahead lay complete uncertainty. The coachman, a stern older man with military bearing, opened the door without comment, his face carefully neutral. Margaret took a breath and stepped inside. The interior was more luxurious than any room she'd ever inhabited, with burgundy velvet seats and polished brass fixtures, but she was alone. The Duke wasn't inside. Somehow, that made it easier. As the carriage lurched into motion, Margaret pressed her face to the window and watched the Worthington mansion recede into the distance. She'd never see that house again, never scrub another floor, or endure another of Edward's drunken advances, or tolerate Mrs. Worthington's cruelty. The thought should have been liberating, yet all she felt was numb. They traveled through the darkened streets of Manhattan, passing from the wealthy brownstones of Fifth Avenue into a neighborhood Margaret didn't recognize. Finally, the carriage stopped before an elegant townhouse with a red door and flower boxes in the windows. The coachman helped her down with surprising gentleness. "Mrs. Pemberton is expecting you, miss," he said, the first words he'd spoken. "She'll see you settled." Then he tipped his hat and drove away, leaving Margaret standing alone on the street. Before she could knock, the door opened to reveal a handsome woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked auburn hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. "Miss Hayes, I presume," she said with a warm smile that transformed her entire face. "I'm Charlotte Pemberton. His Grace sent word that you'd be arriving. Please come in from the cold." She ushered Margaret inside, taking her satchel with easy familiarity. The entrance hall was warm and inviting, decorated with paintings and fresh flowers, rather than the cold opulence of the Worthington home. "I don't understand," Margaret said, her voice small. "Where am I? Why did the Duke send me here?" Mrs. Pemberton led her into a cozy sitting room and gestured for her to sit in an upholstered chair by the fire. "This is my home," she explained, settling across from Margaret with the grace of someone completely comfortable in her own space. "Alexander, the Duke, is my nephew, though we keep that connection relatively quiet. He asked if I would provide you with sanctuary until you determine what you'd like to do with your life." Margaret's mind reeled. Sanctuary. What she'd like to do. The concepts were so foreign she could barely process them. "I'm a servant," she said, feeling stupid even as the words left her mouth. "I clean houses. I serve at tables. That's all I know how to do." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes softened with something that looked like pity, but also understanding. "My dear girl, you're 20 years old. You have an entire lifetime ahead of you to become whatever you wish. Alexander saw something in you tonight, something worth saving. I trust his judgment." "But why?" The question burst from Margaret before she could stop it. "He doesn't know me. I'm nobody. Why would a duke risk scandal for someone like me?" Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a moment, studying Margaret with those perceptive eyes. "My nephew hasn't smiled in 5 years," she said finally. "His wife's death nearly destroyed him, and he's lived in a prison of grief and duty ever since. Tonight, for the first time since Julia passed, I saw him take an action purely because he wanted to, not because it was expected or required. You gave him that, Miss Hayes. You reminded him what it feels like to be alive." The revelation stunned Margaret into silence. She'd thought she was being rescued, but perhaps it was more complicated than that. Perhaps they'd rescued each other in some small way. "I don't want charity," she said carefully, needing Mrs. Pemberton to understand. "I'll work for my keep. I can clean, cook, whatever you need." But the older woman was already shaking her head. "You're not here as a servant. You're here as my guest, and potentially my student." "Your student?" Margaret echoed. Mrs. Pemberton rose and moved to a bookshelf, running her fingers along the leather spines with obvious affection. "I taught literature at Vassar College for 20 years before retiring. I've seen hundreds of young women pass through my classes, most of them privileged girls who took their education for granted. But occasionally, I encountered someone with genuine intellectual curiosity, someone hungry to learn. Alexander told me you have that quality. He saw it in your eyes." Margaret's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. No one had ever spoken to her about education, about potential, about having a mind worth cultivating. "I can read," she offered tentatively. "My mother taught me before she died. I used to sneak books from the Worthington Library and read them in my room at night." The admission felt dangerous, like revealing a secret part of herself she'd kept hidden for years. "Excellent," Mrs. Pemberton said, with evident satisfaction. "Then we'll begin tomorrow. I'll teach you literature, history, philosophy, anything you wish to learn. In the meantime, let's get you fed and settled. You look exhausted." She rang a small bell, and a maid appeared, but she addressed Margaret with the same respectful tone she'd used with Mrs. Pemberton, calling her Miss, without irony or condescension. Something inside Margaret's chest loosened slightly. After a simple but delicious meal of soup and fresh bread, the maid, a cheerful young woman named Iris, showed Margaret to a bedroom on the second floor. It was modest compared to the rest of the house, but to Margaret it was palatial. A real bed with clean sheets, a desk by the window, a wardrobe for clothing she didn't yet possess, and a small bookshelf already stocked with novels. "Mrs. P. prepared this room special for you," Iris said with a conspiratorial wink. She was proper excited when the Duke's message arrived. She loves a good project. Alone finally, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. This morning, she'd been a servant with no prospects beyond endless drudgery. Tonight, she was sleeping in a comfortable room in a kind woman's house, with the promise of education and the attention of a mysterious duke who'd swept her across a ballroom floor in front of all of New York society. It felt like a fairy tale, which meant it probably couldn't last. She changed into her worn nightgown and slipped between the clean sheets, but sleep eluded her. Her mind kept returning to those intense grey eyes, to the feeling of Alexander's hand on her back as they danced, to the way he'd stepped between her and Mrs. Worthington like a shield. He'd called her real, but she didn't even know what that meant anymore. She'd spent so long being invisible that she'd almost forgotten she existed at all. A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Mrs. Pemberton entered, carrying a tray with tea and small cakes. "I suspected you might be having trouble sleeping," she said, setting the tray on the desk. "First nights in new places are always difficult, especially after such dramatic circumstances." She settled into the chair by the window, and Margaret sat up, pulling her blanket around her shoulders. "Would you like to talk about it?" "I'm afraid," Margaret admitted quietly. "Afraid this is a dream. Afraid I'll wake up tomorrow back in the servants' quarters. Afraid that—" She trailed off, unsure how to voice her deepest fear. "Afraid that the Duke will realize he made a mistake," Mrs. Pemberton finished gently. Margaret nodded, feeling foolish. The older woman poured 2 cups of tea, the familiar ritual somehow soothing. "Margaret, may I tell you something about my nephew?" "Please," Margaret said, accepting the cup with both hands, grateful for its warmth. Mrs. Pemberton gazed into her own tea, as if reading the leaves. "Alexander was married at 25 to a woman named Julia Rothschild, a love match, which is rare in our circles. She was brilliant, passionate, kind. They were genuinely happy. But Julia had a weak heart, and 3 years into their marriage, she died suddenly. Alexander found her collapsed in their garden. He was holding her when she passed.